Three, two, one, here we go. Rainman's Take podcast. Observations on the world we live in. My take on current events and other topics of interest. Also interviews with some really cool people. So let's get the conversation going. Hey everybody, it's the Rain Man. Got another great episode for you today with my guest, Dan McMillan. We're going to be talking about money in politics. And we'll get into that in a second. But before I start, if you are part of the Rain Man's Take community, thank you very much. If you're new to the program, welcome. I know you're going to love the content. So if you could go ahead and hit that subscribe button in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And also if you could watch this video to the end, that'll help me out with the YouTube algorithm, which in turn will help me get this word out to more people. And it will continue the conversation going, which is the ultimate goal of Rain Man's Take. So with that being said, Dan, welcome. How are you, sir?
Good to be with you, Brian. It's good today.
Great. A little bit about Dan. So Dan McMillan founded and leads Save Democracy in America. It's a nonpartisan campaign to get big money out of politics using the voter dollars reform. So he is definitely an expert in this space. Dan holds a history PhD from Columbia, as well as a law degree, and has worked as a history professor and as a prosecuting attorney. In 2014, he published an acclaimed book for the general public on the causes of the Holocaust, and that was titled, How Could This Happen? Explaining the Holocaust. And just as an aside, that's going to be another episode for down the road because that book is going to be fascinating. Dan has given over 90 interviews about politics. And again, he runs the Save Democracy in America. And off of that website, here's a little bit about that group. Save Democracy in America unites Americans across party lines to defeat big money, which stole our rightful say in how we are governed. We stand for one thing and one thing only, government by the people, which is one of the noble ideals which makes us Americans. So we are going to get into all of that today. But Dan, again, thank you very much for your time. And why don't we start off by just tell me a little bit about how you got into focusing on the issue of money in politics in America.
Well, Brian, I started politics when I turned 20, which was in 1980. And already by the end of the 80s, it just seemed to me and everyone around me that something had gone badly wrong in American politics. It just seemed like the conversation just seemed to leave us behind, that what people were talking about on TV and, say, the debates between candidates, the 88 presidential campaign between Bush Sr. and Dukakis was just terrible. And the conversation seemed so empty, so trivialized. And on the other hand, the middle class was getting hollowed out. We were exporting jobs. Schools were not performing as well as they could. And somehow there was this discontent. It was almost like they ignored us. And no one was really in Washington politics was talking about our concerns. So that's something I've followed all this time. It's concerned me all this time. Sometime around the turn of the century, I really came to think of money in politics as maybe the biggest problem we've got, because I knew that the cost of campaigns there'd been an arms race going on between the parties and fundraising and spending that already kicked off about the beginning of the 90s. And I saw the kind of sums you had to raise, and I said to myself, wait a minute, if you got to raise $1 million to run for the House and I don't know, half a billion to run for the presidency, you're not getting that money from me or from other ordinary citizens. You're getting it from deep-pocketed donors and special interests, multimillionaires, and so on. And are you really listening to me? And can you do anything that is unattractive to those people? Because if you're running for office, it's great to have looks. It's great to have charisma. Having good ideas sure doesn't hurt. But the one thing you absolutely desperately have to have is money. Without that, you are nowhere. And so I began to focus on it. And then already before I finished the final copy edited manuscript of my Holocaust book at the fall of 2013, I'd already been more focused on money because of the Citizens United decision in 2010 that kind of further opened the floodgates, kind of stripped away some of the few remaining limits on funding and spending, fundraising and spending. And I decided that my next book was going to be about money in politics and how it had undermined government by the people and how we might fix it. And so I studied, there were a lot of books out there in different aspects of it. of the picture. I studied different reform proposals that people had made, different models for fixing it. And I wrote at least a couple hundred pages in different unpublished pockets, parts of chapters. And then by the spring of 2020, I had a couple of realizations. One was I'd read some terrific books about different aspects of the money problem. A really good one is by Jane Mayer called Dark Money, and that's about the Koch brothers and this network of anonymous donors. I mean, the names of the people in that network is a secret,
Right.
and the impact that they have had. And yet, none of these books had moved the needle politically. And no matter how good a book I wrote, that was probably not going to move the needle politically either. And the other thing I saw, having been up to that point a lifelong Democrat, and I heard Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in the Democratic primary for 2020, at least talking about money in politics, kind of making some noise about it. But then as soon as but they didn't really talk about an actual solution. And by then I kind of had arrived at this voter dollars idea, which had been out there for 20 years already. And they knew about voter dollars, but instead of talking about voter dollars, well, we need a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, and amending the Constitution is very difficult. And I had a second realization, which was that even no matter how well intentioned, that the campaigns have gotten so expensive that no one in Washington really can lead on this issue anymore, can deliver on this issue, because they're all too dependent on their donors. And Sanders and Warren, they raised a lot more than anyone else in small dollar donations, that is under $200, which is still an awful lot of money for most Americans, but still, it was a broader base. And that gave them, I think, the freedom to sort of, offer these more progressive economic policies that would tick off a lot of corporate donors. But at the end of the day, they had their big donors too. And, you can't, and I don't say this to question anyone's sincerity. I don't mean that at all. It's just a reality that politicians have to live with. It's the way the game is played. I mean, you can't go out on the campaign trail and tell the voters the truth that big money in politics is evil and it has robbed you of your voice in government. And the next day, call up your evil donors and ask them for more of your evil money. It'd be a pretty awkward conversation.
Yeah.
And at that point, I said, I guess, I'm going to have to man up and figure out how to be a politician. And that the only way we're going to get this, and by then I'd settle on the voter dollars reform, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Because I think it's an amazing idea. I wish I'd invented it, but it doesn't matter. It's a great idea. But that the only way we're going to get a serious reform that really solves this problem or puts a big dent in it, the money problem, is it's got to come from the people. It's not going to come from D.C. They're all trapped in dependence on their donors. They spend most of their free time raising money for the next reelection campaign. They don't have time to even think about us and listen to us. And it only happens. Really, I think that what it's going to take to make this happen is for the money problem and the voter dollar solution to become a top 5 issue in the national conversation in a presidential year. If that happens, because I think the voter dollars idea is so inherently attractive and common sense and does have proven appeal to Americans left, right, and center, it's a rare cross-partisan point of consensus. As long as enough Americans hear about it, we're going to get a majority of Americans who say, okay, we've had enough, and so on. And it's a larger argument that I'd like to, that I want to spell out and make about why I'm optimistic and why I think we can get there. Yeah. And not necessarily, maybe even as early as 2028. Let me stop first. I haven't let you get a word in edgewise. See if you have any questions so far. And then maybe we can talk about what voter dollars is.
Yep. And actually, I've got a ton. First of all, one comment that it would be, and this is my personal view. When we talked in pre-production, you said, Brian, listen, I'm bipartisan. This is a bipartisan issue. I don't like to actually get into one side or the other, but I will. And that is, and actually this is actually bipartisan. And that is, do you think it's when Elizabeth Warren or somebody says, my evil donor, do you think before that guy or that woman writes her a check, she says, listen, I know you got to say that in public, but just, you say it in public and then you and I are buddy behind the scenes. Is that how that goes? Please tell me that it isn't, but it feels like that.
Well, I'm sure with a lot of people in elective office, it is really that ugly. I don't like to attribute that to any individual.
Yeah.
I guess, I always like to give people the benefit of the doubt. And, it's interesting, before we went on air, I think we were talking about like what kind of person goes into politics knowing that their most important part of the job is fundraising, and what kind of person stays in politics after it really became that way. Because when you think about it, it's kind of degrading when you spend most of your time kind of, sucking up to
Yeah.
rich people, to special interests, to ask for money. Nonetheless, I don't like to judge people because I think that what people in Washington tell themselves, and it's not an unreasonable thing for them to say to themselves and to each other, is, yeah, it stinks, this system, but my heart's in the right place. I do want to do what's right for the American people. And thanks to my political skill and good intentions, I will get a better job for my constituents than my opponent. And I think that's how they stay in, and even how people go in. Although more and more you look at how the Senate, for example, the whole Congress, but especially the Senate, looks increasingly like sort of a cross between a country club and a nursing home. I think both parties may have kind of a recruiting problem bringing in fresh blood, young people coming up.
Yeah.
Also because really to challenge an incumbent now, even for the House, much less the Senate, if you're challenging an incumbent, I think or a seat is open. I don't see how you can do that with less than $2 million. So as a practical matter, you almost have to be a millionaire and have millionaire friends to be able to run. And that also kind of thins down the talent pool and creates this recruiting problem. But I guess, the larger question you have is, there's no question this is a corrupting system. It has corrupted people. And sometimes I think it is exactly as cynical as you say. But I guess I try to look for the good in people. And I think most of these people, they're not monsters. They're just trapped in a bad situation.
Yeah. And I hope that is the case. And again, Dan's website is savedemocracyinamerica.org. And if you're at all interested in it, I highly recommend you check it out. The other point I was going to make about what you had just commented on was, if a representative, as soon as they get into office, they're immediately starting to think about the next election cycles. That means they're immediately starting to talk to their donors. If that's the case, then they've basically given their responsibilities over to all their aides to do all the kind of work, right?
And that is also true. Indeed, this was already 8 years ago when campaigns at the federal level were far less expensive than they are now. Because, for example, between 2016 and 2020, the total cost of the federal campaigns in constant dollars and 2020 dollars more than doubled from 7 million to 14.4. So that is Congress and White House together. So we know, so even before that had begun, there was God bless him, this Florida congressman, a Republican congressman named David Jolly, who I think served only one term. He blew the whistle on the fact that both parties have within walking distance of the Capitol these dedicated call centers full of these little cubicles, and you go into the cubicle, and the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee has supplied you with a binder with a readout with the phone numbers of people to call to raise money and especially if you're in the House where you have to stand for re-election every 2 years, the fundraising never stops. You start, and I've heard this has been said 100 times by representatives, you start making your fundraising calls for the next election as soon as you've won this election. It starts immediately. And Jolly said already back then that the average member of the House was spending 30 hours a week on the phone during their time in D.C. And they called it dialing for dollars. That was the cynical term they had.
Yeah.
So where do they find time to do the nation's business? I hadn't thought of the angle, though, that you raised, that they delegate so much important work to their staff. And that's kind of another way of saying that we, the people, are being neglected because of this process. And if it was that bad, 9 years ago, given how much more expensive elections have got, it can only be worse. It was 30 hours a week then. What is it now? 40?
Yeah.
50? I don't know.
And the one thing that definitely became very apparent this past election cycle, and I'm sure it's been the same, it really is in the forefront. And then this is kind of lead up to my next question for you. And that was, you actually had the donor class on the news channels talking about, so they were almost glorifying the donors. And I'll just throw it out there because I found it kind of interesting because usually they're behind the scenes, right? Except for the big guys, the Koch brothers, the Gates, and all the sort of the usual suspects. But the one that really surprised me was that I think his name is David Morgan, who runs the Morgan and Morgan law firm, which is this national law firm. And you see the commercials all over television about injury attorneys and that sort of thing, Morgan and Morgan. And he just happens to be one of the largest donors for the Democratic Party. And my question is, the media has got to be complicit in this as well because they're glorifying the big money in the process. Is that accurate?
It's not only that. I mean, they really come to see. It's interesting in the coverage. It becomes more brazen with every cycle and normalized that they sort of report on what does this or that mega donor think about the party's strategy or that candidate. I still remember, like when was this? I think this was in the 2020 Republican primary. A lot of people who were thinking about donating to Tim Scott were concerned about the fact that he wasn't married. And, he had a girlfriend, but he wasn't married. And it's like, wait a minute, since when is that? I mean, it's one thing if voters say, I want to vote for a guy who's married because I see stability or whatever else. When donors are basically telling this guy, chiding him about his personal life because it's displeasing to them. But, what's also interesting is that more and more, because it is really a measure of candidates' chances of success, you turn on TV and they report who raised how much money in this time, or who's got bigger donors, or so-and-so's got this much in their war chest. But they never turn around and then ask, well, does this then influence policy? Does this mean that these people have a lot of influence and we, the people, have little or no influence? They don't talk about it, which is very interesting. Now, I can think of two reasons why that's so. One is, of course, that they all work for profitable media conglomerates that themselves lay money on politicians and hire armies of lobbyists. And I think the other is that also that campaign media buys are a major profit source, major revenue source for media companies. So it's weird. It's kind of this. It's sort of schizoid almost. More and more, they've been showing us how crucially important the money is and this outside influence of these mega donors, but how bad it is and the problems it causes. Right. Then we don't hear anything about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's dive right into it then. You mentioned it earlier, but the whole idea of voter reform and what are your thoughts on what needs to be done to get money out of politics?
Well, it's wonderfully simple. Since the only people with any influence anymore in D.C. are deep-pocketed donors, we must make ourselves the donors. That's our slogan at Save Democracy in America: make voters the donors. The way it would work, I call it voter dollars. It has also been called democracy dollars or democracy vouchers. It has been used for city elections in Seattle since 2017 and used successfully. And the way it would work concretely is that for every 2-year cycle, that basically everyone, once they register to vote, they get an online account, a voter dollars account. And every 2 years for federal elections, you get money in that account to donate to candidates. We're calling for $100 per voter in a presidential year, $50 for the midterms, which are less expensive. And you can't take the money out and spend it, but you go online and send it to the candidates that you want to support. And if you fund it at that level, which is robust and it's a lot of money, and it is taxpayer dollars here we're talking about, it's public funds. But if you do that, then candidates who want to support us can raise enough money from us, money controlled by us, the American people, to fund a strong campaign, and their opponent no longer has any excuse for taking money, from Elon Musk, George Soros, Big Pharma, you name it, the teachers union, you name the favorite villain, and so that's really how it works. And it has, I'm very optimistic about making it happen. Let me just take a moment to point out some of its political strengths, because one is just its simplicity. You can summarize it in 4 words: make voters the donors. It's common sense. As the old saying goes, whoever pays the piper calls the tune. Well, if we want to call the tune in Washington, we got to pay that piper. We got to fund those campaigns, even if we don't like it. Maybe best of all is the way that it empowers each and every one of us, because so many Americans just feel defeated by our political system, and have tuned out politics because they feel there's nothing I can do. And frankly, that's a very irrational way for Americans to feel, because right now we are by and large powerless. I mean, our vote still counts for something, and we should vote, but it doesn't count for anywhere near what it deserves to count for. This way, what this system does, it says to us, we are literally going to put the coin of political influence into your hands to use as you see fit. And candidates are going to have to come to you now, not just for your vote, but for something they need a lot more urgently than they need your vote, which is the campaign cash. Because if they don't have that cash, they're in no position to ask anyone for their vote. And they won't be taken seriously by the media. And so that's how, and I guess the final thing I just want to emphasize, and we'll come back to this, is that I've, experienced, including a poll of 700 New Hampshire voters that I commissioned in 2023, as well as it's actually by now about 100 media appearances on outlets across the spectrum politically, left to right. I've gotten such a positive response. This seems to be something, getting money out of politics is absolutely something that has like 3/4 support or more among Americans, regardless of party. Yeah. And so that this is actually one of the few genuinely unifying issues, which is another benefit of it, because I see it also as an opportunity to bring Americans together in shared purpose and in service of our shared ideals, because this is about government by the people, and that's what our country stands for. But anyway, you have some questions.
Absolutely, and let's just start with the Seattle example. So, what did the city have to change? How politicians, how they campaigned? What had to change? And then was it a mandatory thing? So you register to vote, and you it's mandatory that you have to put some money into that fund, or how did that work? Because it doesn't seem like it's strong enough to actually pull.
It's tricky to compare, because participation at the municipal level is so much less than at the national level or even the state level. So like the percentage of voters who actually, and what they did is actually, also it wasn't just limited to registered voters. They mailed to every Seattle resident 4 paper vouchers of $25 each. And you could then give these vouchers, you could either mail them into a central office with the names of the candidates you wanted to support, where you could actually give the vouchers to the candidates who could redeem them. But they, and that was, they didn't really have to change the voting laws. But one thing that's interesting, though, I think they passed it, they established it by ballot initiative. I think the ballot initiative vote was in 2015. So 2017 is the first election that they used this. You wouldn't say that the numbers who participated are not spectacular or impressive, although you do see a great broadening of sort of downward socially of people who are now donating, instead of people only sort of in the upper middle class or above who are donating. And you also had something that's very relevant to our discussion is in 2018, Jeff Bezos and his cronies decided they wanted a city council more to their liking. And so they invested an unprecedented $1.5 million in 7 city council races. But because the citizens of Seattle had been educated about the importance of money in politics through the campaign to get this initiative passed and through the establishment of the voter dollar system, it just completely backfired on Bezos and his crew. Oh yeah, everyone was furious, and he was trying to buy our government, and his candidates went down to defeat. And I especially like to mention that because one of the most common objections raised to this system is that the thing is that thanks to the Supreme Court decided already back in the 70s that money used to purchase influence in government by helping politicians with a donation or spending, that the money itself is speech, free speech, protected by the First Amendment, which is, to me, that's the ultimate triumph of book learning over common sense. I don't think you can go into any bar in the country at any time of day and find 7 patrons inebriated enough to buy into that idea. It's just really stupid. So they did, including Thurgood Marshall, who's kind of a hero of mine. This was in 1976. Anyway, and then in recent years, under John Roberts, the court has just taken that bad argument to its most extreme conclusion. Citizens United is just one of the cases that descended from this case, Buckley v. Vallejo, in the 1970s. Anyway, the long and the short of it is we can't limit any attempt to limit how someone's donating or spending, the court will strike down as a violation of people's First Amendment rights. That makes no sense, but the court's not going anywhere. And so people will then say to me, well, then aren't the billionaires just going to swamp your system with 5 times more money? And I guess that my answer to that is that once we built the kind of support we need to make Congress give us this reform, and so we're talking about, again, top 5 issue in a presidential year, majority of Americans in opinion polls saying to Congress, look, we want this or you lose a job. When it gets to that point, when the American people so fully understand how crucial money is, then any candidate, any billionaire who tries to swamp the system to help a candidate, and the candidate legally will be free to accept that money, but that help's going to be toxic politically. Yeah. And the Bezos example is a good reason for optimism that's the way it would turn out.
And that's actually fascinating. So I always say this on my podcast, and that is the only way that this survives, and this is not my thought originally, it's Benjamin Franklin. The only way that America survives in this, our government survives, is if people participate. We're participating citizenry who are actually paying attention to what's going on, who are paying attention to the individual that Bezos is giving money to. That's the only way that type of thing works. And for me, that I think is great. And I just hope the general population can buy into that. Next question is, do you think it's scalable from the small city Seattle election cycle? Do you think that that's scalable to be national?
I think if anything, it's easier to do at the national level than it is the city level, just because national level politics are much higher profile. Even like House and Senate races are increasingly becoming nationalized. So it's like you're for Trump, you're against Trump. It's the issues of the particular district or state are kind of fading a bit. I think given the level of interest in national politics and given the level of just discontent, that the American people feel with the political system, and we've been feeling it for a long time. I mean, me and my friends, we were saying since the 80s, I can go, I can still vote, but I got nothing to vote for. 85% of Americans in a poll 3 years ago said that our political change needs to be, completely reformed or needs major changes, about 40% of each. And that's pretty consistent across party affiliation, left, right, and center. So the American people know the system is broken. I think we want it to be fixed. I think one of the most important reasons for Donald Trump's enduring support is that people see him as an outsider to the system, as an enemy of the system who's going to. One of the things I most often hear from MAGA Republicans whom I talk to is, and I'm not sure I like him personally, but he'll shake things up, because things in D.C. do need to be shaken up. Now, I'm not saying he's going to deliver the reform we need, and he's not talking about how to get money out of politics. So I'm not siding for or against him. I don't take either side. But I do think that's a huge part. It's something that Democrats just don't understand. They attribute bad motives to a lot of his supporters. I think a lot of his supporters, because fundamentally we want government by the people again. We know we're not getting it. We don't know what the path is. And, it's interesting. So we're talking about scalable, and people sort of asked me sometimes, will people really use their voter dollars? But the thing is, actually giving your voter dollars to a candidate is so much easier than actually voting. Voting you can only do within a window or by mail, or you show up on a certain day. But during the whole cycle, you can assign your voter dollars from the privacy of your home at any time of day or night. From a smartphone, from a computer. Probably we should find a way to make it available from ATMs so that people without computers or some other, can without access to computers can use it. But basically, anytime you have access to the internet and your password, you can do it. So if anything, the rate of participation in the voter dollar system would exceed the rate of voting, I think.
And again, I'm trying to get complete clarification on this concept. What would need to, and I assume you go into this in more detail. And again, the website is savedemocracyinamerica.org. What would need to, obviously rules would have to be put in place, like the Bezos, that rule is everybody's going to know that Bezos is dumping a ton of money into the process. So that rule that needs to get changed to allow for that type of transparency. How does that come about at the national level? Is that a congressional? Is that
I'm not sure I understood that last question, Brian.
How will you set it up such that there is that level of transparency at the national level?
You mean that the system is transparent, or?
Yeah, like the way I understood the Seattle example is somehow the citizens of Seattle found out that Bezos was dumping a ton of money, obviously towards one candidate or the other, and then that candidate becomes super toxic. That level of what was in place that allowed for
for people to know that was happening.
Correct.
Yeah, but I have to assume that they have reasonably good disclosure laws in Seattle. At the federal level, disclosure laws are very weak and riddled with exceptions. And of course, you've heard a lot about dark money, which is these groups that according to part of the Internal Revenue Code, as long as they don't spend more than 49% of their revenue, of their expenditure on political activity, and that limit can easily be gamed. You can redefine things as not political.
Yep.
They don't have to reveal their donors. And so in this last election, I think that the amount of dark money easily topped. Actually, I should have the numbers at hand, but it had to be well over $1 billion. It could be multiple billions. And the Democrats, at least in recent years, have benefited from more dark money than Republicans have, at least at the national level, which is interesting because the Democrats used to think that they owned campaign finance reform, but the fact is neither party in D.C. really is going to do anything on it. In any case, and we need better disclosure levels at the national level. I think that once we've built the support we need to get this reform through voter dollars, getting good disclosure rules is going to be a cinch. Because I'll tell you also in the polling I did, the level of outrage over the concept of dark money, because one of the questions I asked these New Hampshire voters was, they were given a series of statements about money in politics. And, so what bothers you? Does this bother you a lot, bother you a little, doesn't bother you at all? And one was, people were able to donate, millions of money to candidates, and we're not even allowed to know their names. When you put it that way, people are really ticked off, and it doesn't matter what party you belong to. So it's an excellent, important question. I took longer to answer it than I should have, but that's how it is.
No, and again, this is a fascinating idea, and if it can work successfully in the local levels, because that's the other thing. What we found out just here in my little town in Encinitas in San Diego, a couple of years ago, the mayor at the time, who's now a state senator up in Sacramento, it was just obvious he was taking a ton of money from developers. It was all sorts of development programs that were just getting pushed through, completely opposite of what the people in the town wanted. So, kind of call that corruption and not corruption, but influence in the whole process, that they were really pumping money into this one candidate because they knew she was going to be on their side. And that's the thing, the citizens did try to let everybody know, hey, these guys look at how much money they're pumping into it. And it didn't seem to work because she obviously got reelected. So, and for some reason it successfully worked in Seattle. So that would be my one concern, is it could work somewhere, but maybe not somewhere else.
Well, I don't believe San Diego has something like voter dollars at present, although there is a group. They do. I believe they're called Voters' Choice San Diego that has been working on that. I don't know what the status of their campaign, but you allude to it, I think, something that is common said, because there are people, commentators, political scientists will say, well, money doesn't rank very high, and on people's, scale of concerns come election time.
Right.
And that's true, but it's also true because no candidate for either party is really going to be making money in politics as an issue, when all candidates of both parties have to raise these sums of money and from private sources instead of from the people, from a public source. No candidate is in a position to use that as a weapon. But suddenly, if you create this alternative pool of money, and then I can go run for Congress, using that money. And if you get money from the voter roll system, then You have to accept strict limits on how much you will accept from other sources.
Right.
No donation over 500, whatever it may be. And my opponent, funds their campaign, with money from pharma. And then I get to say to the voters, and also if there's a debate, which makes it even worse for my opponent, my opponent wants to be a stooge for big pharma and keep your drug prices high. That's why their campaign is funded by big pharma. But I want to serve you, and that's why my campaign is funded with voter dollars. Well, I don't like my opponent's chances, I have to tell you.
Yeah. Now, all right, here's a very interesting question, and that is, is what you're proposing, this voter dollars, is that hostile towards politicians, big business? I mean, is it? Are we saying completely do away with that?
No, I'm so glad you asked that, because it can be interpreted that way. Some of the conversation about money in politics, particularly coming from Bernie Sanders, has been sort of the 99% against the 1%, and big business is evil. And that's absolutely not my message, because, my message is unifying. My message is that the money has a dynamic of its own. Candidates need to raise it. It's gotten out of hand. And the thing is that the donors who give the money and the politicians who take it are doing what they have to do. And it's unfair to expect otherwise. I mean, let's say I'm the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and I don't find ways, usually it's by me and my shareholders and managers' donations. Corporations are not allowed to donate directly to politicians. But one way or another, if I don't find ways to lay a lot of money on politicians, on candidates to keep them happy with me, and if I don't hire an army of lobbyists to then call in all the favors that I purchased, well, I'm forfeiting an advantage to my competitors. I'm not doing my job, and I'm neglecting my fiduciary duty to my employees and shareholders. For me, the way I like to look at what I love to say is, our fellow Americans are not the enemy. The money's the enemy, and it is the enemy of us all. I mean, it's even the enemy of the big donors now, because you hear this all the time. You hear this from people in business. What they most need from government, from the political system, is predictability and stability. And predictability and stability have gone out the window in our country. And they're not coming back until we the people, feel and see that we're in charge and that our government is legitimate. And I think, so a lot of people sort of tell me, well, once you gain traction, you're going to be crushed by an avalanche of special interest money funding negative ads. I can't guarantee that won't happen, but I think a lot of those people in the donor class are farsighted to know that this also is not working. Something's got to give.
Yeah. Yeah. And that brings up my next question. That is, obviously, the critics of this concept of voter dollars, the critics, what are some of the objections other than what you just said, that, the big money is going to overwhelm the system? What other objections or dissents are you hearing from people regarding this process?
So another one that I mentioned was the thought that people might not use their voter dollars, but I don't think that makes sense, given that using it is so much easier than the actual act of voting. The strongest objection again, and I get this more often from Republicans, is, wait a minute, my tax dollars going to food stamps for politicians, those bums? And that's a very reasonable response. But I would say, first of all, this is a reform that surely would pay for itself dozens of times over in all the wasteful government spending that lobbyists have extracted, goodies that lobbyists have extracted from Congress because of the muscle they have from the political donations made by their donors. I would also say, as a practical matter, look, the candidates are going to get the money from somewhere. If they don't get it from us, then we're not in charge. They're going to get it from somewhere else. They're going to take care of their donors. If we're the donors, they take care of us. We have government by the people. If someone else is the donor, then we don't have government by the people. And I guess the final thing I'd say is that, you look in World War II, we spent probably by now, I think, at least $5 trillion in today's money, and more than 400,000 Americans gave their lives, not even for our freedom, which was never under credible military threat, but for the freedom of others in 2 continents, for the freedom of all of humankind, to uphold the democratic form of government, to slay tyranny. And what would those heroic Americans think if they saw us hesitate to spend a few $1 billion to take back for ourselves here at home that same freedom that Americans have bled to give to others. That's,
Great
I
way to
guess, for me, that's the gut punch for me. That's kind of what gets me out of bed in the morning, to do
no,
this.
and that's a great way to look at it. Am I correct when I say that, at least the way I understand it, they have actually dollar amount limits in elections in Europe?
Well,
Is it like,
yeah, it varies from country to country. I think the biggest limitation is that election season is limited to 6 or 8 weeks
gotcha.
in all the parliamentary systems, also in Canada, Australia, I'm pretty sure. And that already, whereas in our country, the election, the campaign never ends in some sense. In some countries have dollar caps. Have financial money caps on the amount of money spent. Also, for example, in Germany, at least a third of the money that the parties spend comes from a public financing. It's not a voter dollars mechanism. It's block grants from the government to the parties, depending on what percentage of the vote they got the last time around. Also, in many of these countries, particularly Germany, which I know best, the mass media, TV and radio and so on, are required to give free time to all the parties. And of course, media buys, that's a huge part of the expense of American elections.
Right.
So that I'm not saying that there are this election coming up in Germany, there have been a few donations here and there of a few million dollars here or there. We're talking billions in our country, a few million here or there, and that's caused quite a lot of outrage. And people are pretty ticked off about it. And they're talking about, we maybe need to change laws to stop that. But basically, our elections, by one calculation in the Wall Street Journal, our federal elections cost 40 times as much as in the UK or Germany. And in our country, it's all private money. Over there, it's a lot of it is public money.
And is that something would somehow, if we were able to limit the campaign season, quote unquote season, to limit the time that people can campaign, obviously that would probably help out with the voter dollars concept as well. But those, what's your sort of crystal ball? Does DC have that appetite? Does DC have the appetite to restrict itself at this point?
No, DC doesn't have an appetite for any of this. And of course, as far as limiting the election season here, I think the Supreme Court would say that violates the First Amendment. So that's another reason why we can't do that. I think that, but I guess I ought to, I think it's good for me to kind of explain why I feel pretty optimistic that we can make this happen. Because I think the most important is, I think that the American people want change. I think we understand on a gut level, on all levels, that this is not working. I think we feel and have felt, and rightly, this is a sign of the good sense, the intelligence of the voters, of the American people, that we are disenfranchised, that the average voter has very little influence on policy, and altogether that the country's needs are not being addressed. A lot of what, indeed, is not even being talked about. No one in either party has really a serious plan for getting us back to fiscal responsibility and closing the deficit. People have various ideas they claim is going to do it, but no, neither party's got a plan. Bringing down we're spending maybe twice as much on healthcare as they are in, say, Canada, France, many other countries, that is per American, per capita. Our infrastructure is crumbling. We've got all kinds of unaddressed problems that they don't even enter the conversation anymore, because a fix to those problems would cut into the financial interest of this or that group of donors. So I think we know it's not working. There's also a very high level of outrage on the part of the American people about money in politics. Most Americans don't, at this point, sort of see money as the number one problem, as the biggest single reason that our vote doesn't count for much anymore. They know it's important, but most Americans can't know exactly how important it is, and don't really understand exactly how it functions, and don't know there's a solution. But I think we want a solution. We've been looking for it. I think, it's interesting, beginning especially in 2008, we keep giving our vote to so-called change candidates. From Obama, it was change we can believe in. Yes, we can. Hope and change. And 2016 was really a very most interesting election, I think, in my lifetime. You had change candidates on both sides of the aisle. You had Trump, who was going to drain the swamp. Bernie was even going to give us a revolution. It's interesting. And then in 2020, Bernie was there with his revolution again. Elizabeth Warren, maybe revolution light. I don't know. Maybe that's not so nice. And I think that, this cycle too, President Trump was effectively the change candidate in this election, and that's why he won. The problem is that none of these change candidates ever gave us a plan for change. And the reason for that is that what most needs changing above all is money in politics, and all of them are too busy raising it to tackle it. And that is the catch-22 that, as I think, has kept our country in a doom loop for so many years. I think the real key to me is publicity, getting the word out, also overcoming the pessimism. So many Americans feel very discouraged, feel the system is so corrupt, it can't be fixed. We've been promised change. We've been promised, things will be better so many times, and we've been disappointed so many times. And the other obstacle, I think, is that both parties have done a great job of persuading us that Americans who vote for the other party are the problem, even the enemy. When in fact, that's not it. The money's the enemy. I mean, I'm not saying we should have a kumbaya moment. Americans should disagree about all kinds of things and disagree often ferociously. We're a big country, we're not a bunch of automatons. We have minds of our own, but that's never been a problem in the past. We've always been able, before the money messed everything up, to really come together and work together constructively and improve the country. And so I feel like the constituency for this reform is gigantic. It's bipartisan. It already exists. It's just that most of the constituents don't know it yet. And so the key is, and I think that, I kind of want to turn to our audience, and say that, if what I'm saying makes sense, if you like voter dollars, or even think just it's interesting and worth thinking about, to, share my conversation with Brian, with your friends. Go to my website, think about sharing my website or links to my interviews. Also on my website, there's a newsletter I've started on Substack. It's free if you could sign up for that. Because, I go on radio, I go on television, I speak in person. I make my best case, but the people in the audience don't know me from Adam. But with someone, I know already, for those of you, since, that being already on Brian's podcast gives me some credibility, but for someone who knows you personally and trusts you, my message about money in politics and voter dollars will always be 100 times more powerful coming from you than will ever be coming from me. Ultimately, what we need is validation. We just need enough Americans to say, oh my gosh, we're not beat. We could fix this. We can take our country back. And this is how. And since this is one thing, again, that it's also something that can bring us together and maybe dial back a bit of the anger somewhat. And I think finally, let me see what other questions you have, and then I just have maybe one closing thought.
Perfect. Absolutely. And again, I want to be respectful of your time here, but this one is important to me as I'm trying to get my head around the whole voter dollars and how it could work. And the question is, does this process, voter dollars, does it benefit one political party more than the other? And I ask that question because in California, it's widely known that it's a super majority, Democratic majority in California. So how would that, would the voter dollars benefit the Democrats over the Republicans? Or is it more of it's actually going to even the playing field, even in a state like California?
I don't think it's going to necessarily make California less blue. If voters are very, very strongly one party or the other, then maybe I guess that party will be benefited. But I think the more, I don't see any reason generally, as a general rule, why it would benefit one party more than the other. But it's going to make the parties very different because the parties are going to be listening to us. Basically, we have a system where you need a lot of money to run for office, so you listen to your donors. Right now, the donors are private donors with deep, deep pockets, and that's who our so-called representatives listen to. Once we become the donors, they listen to us, and then both parties get a lot better because both parties, I think, stop picking fights with each other to distract us from their failures and kind of, get down to fixing the things that are broken in our country.
Yeah. And you mentioned it earlier. I'm one of those skeptics. I think things have gotten way off the rails, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on, because it is a positive. It is an optimistic. Let's move forward together type of a message. So in the last couple of minutes we have, why don't you just kind of give your closing remarks here and make me feel more optimistic about the future.
Okay. But just in case people would like to help out, the website is savedemocracyinamerica.org, savedemocracyinamerica.org. But if you Google Dan McMillan Money and Politics, you'll get there too. When I look at our political situation, if this were happening to Germans or Canadians or South Koreans or whoever, I might well be pessimistic. I might say, boy, those people are really in trouble. And I think our situation is bad. But we're not just any people, and this is not just any country. This is, for every other people on earth, government by the people is an option. For us, it's existential. It's who we are. This is the only country where the nation, membership in the nation, does not depend on the color of your skin or which God you worship or even where you were born. It depends on ideals. For me, the Holy Trinity of American ideals is individual freedom, equality of opportunity, and government by the people, which, after all, we invented. In its modern form, not only did we invent it, but by my count, at least 800,000 Americans have given their lives in wars fought for the freedom of others. Our freedom has not been under credible military threat since the War of 1812. And so we have something, we have an ace in the hole, but that even understates it, that no other nation on earth has. We are defined by ideals, that these are noble ideals, that these ideals unify us, that make us happy. They're about loving each other, and they're life-affirming ideals. And we have shown ourselves capable of a degree of idealism that you will see nowhere else on earth. And I'm speaking here specifically as an academic historian whose specialty was German history. So I taught German history and world history, have a lot of expertise in European, and tell you there's no one like us. The kind of idealism that you see in our country in so many different parts of our history, there's no parallel in the history of any other country. And so I guess I say in conclusion, this fight may not be easy, but to me, I think it is simple. At the end of the day, we just have to remember who we are and what our country stands for.
And again, it's savedemocracyinamerica.org. I highly recommend you get on there and learn as much as you can about it. It's the idea that the American people have more power than maybe we think we do currently. So, Dan, really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming on.
I really appreciate this opportunity to put my ideas before our fellow Americans. You really helped out a lot. I think it's a contribution to the movement.
Yep, it has to. I would love to see this get some legs, because it's something that needs to change in our politics. You seem like you've got you seem like this voter dollars is something that I think a lot of people, once they know about it, can get behind it.
Yeah, that's what I think too.
Good. Well, listen, I'll finish off like I always do. If you're in the military, police departments, fire departments, or first responders, if that's you out there, thank you very much for your service. Dan McMillan, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me, Brian.
All right, guys, this is the Rain Man. Till next time, thanks for watching. Thanks for watching Rain Man's Take, observations on the world we live in. If you like the content, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. You can also follow Rain Man's Take on Instagram at Rain Man's Take. Also, check out our website at www.rainmanstakepodcast.com and send your comments to rainmanstake@gmail.com. Keep an eye out for future podcasts, which will be coming out every Thursday at 5 p.m. West Coast time.